Hi. I wanted to do a short video on judging whiskey. Not because it's anything most people need to do, but just because it's interesting. And I get questions about it from time to time. And the process is a bit different than how I would enjoy whiskey on my own or evaluate whiskey on my own. So I guess actually stepping back, what are kind of competitions and awards? There's a few. If we start with awards, you kind of have two types of awards broadly. You have awards given by individual people, who would be single reviewers who basically would pick their favorite based on what they like and how they would, kind of rate a whiskey. And, say this is my whiskey of the year. Those ones you need to be careful with, because if you're not aligned with kind of the preferences and taste of the person that is giving out those awards, can be far from your favorite whiskey. So a lot of whiskey awards that are given by individual reviewers, rarely for myself, who taste hundreds of whiskeys a year, rarely are those my favorite that I've had. So often they're good, but there can be some differences in opinion, and people value different things, and people's palates are all very different. So everyone genetically is sensitive to different things, and then also training is a component of your palate. So you'd be really quite amazed at how your palate can develop with some dedicated time. And so there's kind of the individual reviewer awards, which you have to be a little cautious of. The other thing I guess I didn't say is, with sensitivity, people can be sensitive to different things. So when distilleries are releasing whiskeys, they have sensory panels, and they are pretty rigorous with who gets on the panel, and they'll do evaluations on, how do they do with earthy flavors, how do they do with fruity flavors, how well can they smell coconut, how well can they detect sulfur. And you might have somebody on a tasting panel who's the moss person. They don't want mossy notes in their whiskey. That person, one of their functions that they perform is they're really sensitive to mossy notes. They don't want mossy notes in their whiskey. So all that to say, everyone's palate sensitivity is different. And so sometimes I smell things that are quite appalling to me, but to my friend that's maybe less sensitive to certain things, they might not find that appalling. And there's preferences too, like how much oak you like in a whiskey. It's very variable from person to person in my experience. So the second type of awards are competitions, where you actually have a panel of judges. And in these competitions you have generally a fairly large number of whiskeys that are submitted. They're reviewed blind, so there's no influence at all on branding, on your previous conceptions about the whiskey. And then because you have a panel, you have people who have different kind of sensitivity towards whiskey, so you get a bit more of a robust result. And for the most part, they're scoring against some rubric that's consistent across the evaluations. So I've judged for a number of competitions, nationally and internationally, and they're all a bit different. So sometimes they're a bit more directed, so you taste all the whiskeys in one category, and then you're kind of picking the best and tasting others. In others, it's kind of a bit of a free-for-all, and there's just tons and tons of whiskey, and there's not a lot of structure, which is my favorite, because I like stats and I like randomness. And so if I can randomly set up the order I taste the whiskey and have time to kind of go about it the way that I like, it's great for me. So I'll go through kind of my process, which is the process if I have free reign in a competition to do whatever I want, to rate the whiskey. How would I go about it? Before I get to that, how do you end up on panels? Kind of interesting. And really it comes down to how do you develop your palate. And really did want to see that's practice. It is remarkable how much your palate improves with training and practice. It's been one of the surprises of my life. Similar to the way you can train your eyes to notice certain things and appreciate, art. You can do the same with your tongue and your nose and tasting whiskey. So my palate really developed when I got into Canadian whiskey. I'm a bit of a 100% or 0% kind of person, which is sometimes great, sometimes unfortunate. But when I got into it, I was also in a phase of life when I had a lot of time, which was great. And I tasted an hour a day, 6 days a week for 3 years, pretty consistently, sorry. And I was just exploring different types, tasting whiskeys on their own and tasting them together, and writing tasting notes and figuring out, like, how much can I pull out of this whiskey? How similar is it? And it's remarkable how things developed over that time. At the beginning, I would spend week after week, I'd pour an Alberta Premium and a 40 Creek side by side, which are two, lighter Canadian whiskeys, and I couldn't tell the difference between them. And month after month, and now you give one of them to me blind, and I can tell you what it is without even needing the other as a reference. And they don't seem similar whiskeys at all to me anymore. They seem very different. So your palate really does develop with sort of as you taste more, both side by side individually, but then also as you actually spend some time kind of thinking about it, in the same way you practice for sports or practice for other things. There is a bit of a mental piece that helps you kind of calibrate. Another thing that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges tasting early, there is identifying different flavors and pulling them out, but the other is actually naming them. And it sometimes takes a while to actually, there's a flavor you recognize, but you don't know what. And actually developing that vocabulary just takes time. And sometimes there's flavors that are so familiar you don't know what they are. Arugula was one that I often smell in certain whiskeys, that it was so familiar, and it was 6 months before I figured out what it was. And then I had an arugula salad. I was like, oh, it's arugula. That's what's in my Alberta rye. So takes time. And sometimes I find that vocabulary can get mismatched as well, which makes tasting notes sometimes challenging to interpret, because certain compounds that you smell in a whiskey, like whiskey's just a massive cocktail of different organic compounds that smell differently. That's what you get the nose from. So one common one's ethyl acetate. It naturally occurs in fermentation, but often gets distilled out. But as you age whiskey, it forms. And to me, I would identify that as blueberry primarily. Lots of other people would say it's green apple. Now, I would say if you actually spend some time with the green apple, you can find some blueberry notes in there. So kind of interesting. I go one way, other people go the other way. We're smelling the same thing, but kind of how we associate them is different. So that's sometimes why I find tasting notes challenging until I kind of understand a reviewer. So enough about that. Competitions. In competitions, you want to taste in flights because you're evaluating whiskey against the field, and so you want to be able to compare side by side. I'd say as you do that, it really brings out the weaknesses and the faults in different whiskeys, and that's very different than tasting them kind of individually. Because when you're tasting them individually, your reference point, you're not necessarily fixed on a reference point, and sometimes those faults don't come out. And there's some whiskeys I actually will enjoy more not in a flight. And actually if I was rating them individually, I would actually rate them higher, drinking as I normally do, kind of one whiskey at a time, than if I were to kind of judge them in a flight. And an example of this is kind of lighter, subtle whiskeys. Often don't do well in competitions. If you look at who wins, it's big, complex whiskeys generally. And that's because if you're tasting one that's kind of subtle and slow and light beside one that's big and complex and rich, that one just dominates. And the kind of light, subtle, slow one, some of its benefits kind of get lost. Which is why sometimes some really nice, subtle light whiskeys don't perform well in competition. At least that's my opinion. So I've prepped a quick flight, added a few to the previous tasting. And so the first thing I do is I want to zero out my palate. And so I want a consistent starting point. People do this with different things. Some people do it with a whiskey. I know my friend Davin, he really likes to start with 40 Creek Barrel Select. That's his baseline. And he always starts there and then he goes into whatever else he's judging. I like to start with black coffee, not super strong. It's just so different. The interesting thing about it is because it's slightly bitter, you start off being a bit less attuned to some of the bitter notes in whiskey. So generally it actually makes whiskey taste better. But I find it's just a really great neutral starting point. I know some people will recommend chocolate. I found chocolate just lingers in my mouth too long. And some of the chocolate notes are close enough to cocoa notes I find in whiskey that it can be a little confusing to me anyway. So I like to start with coffee. Sometimes if I don't have coffee or I want to start somewhere else, tea works as well for me. Some beers work as well, although then you're starting with alcohol before alcohol, so it's not always what you want to do.